I went into the boss's office and caught him kissing my wife. The air felt heavier, reality folding in on itself in slow motion as my eyes registered what my mind refused to accept. My chest tightened, a crushing weight, a hot fury rising up my throat like I was swallowing lava. They were there, so close, so surrendered, as if the world had stopped to give them a moment of privacy that I should never have witnessed. The touch of his hands on her waist, their lips pressed together, the look of desire that no longer belonged to me. The bitter taste of betrayal settled in my mouth before I could even take a deep breath. My vision blurred for a moment, but it wasn't crying. It was anger. A hatred that burned, that screamed inside me, that demanded revenge at full volume. My heart was beating so hard I could hear the sound of it in my ears. The shock was brief, because within seconds, something more powerful took me. The need to act. It couldn't be just another man who discovers a betrayal and puts his head down. I couldn't swallow this humiliation and move on as if nothing had happened. No. I needed to destroy everything they had, the same way they destroyed my life. Without hesitation, without giving them time to run or come up with cheap excuses, I turned around and did something that few would have the courage to do. I revealed the betrayal there, in front of everyone. My scream echoed off the cold walls of the office, reverberating like thunder piercing the air. Look everyone. Here is the great leader, the exemplary boss, taking another man's wife like a filthy rat. Silence fell like a dead weight on the environment, looks turned, hands paused on keyboards, whispers filled the space. Chaos ensued. My wife suddenly pulled away from him, her eyes wide, her hands shaking, her mouth opening and closing as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. The boss, on the other hand, tried to maintain his pose. A crooked smile, a straightening of his tie, as if he could get around it with the arrogant charm that had made him feel untouchable for so long. But there, in front of everyone, he was nothing more than a man caught in the act, a cornered predator with no way out. This isn't what it seems, he tried, his voice thick with falsehood, but no one believed it. Because that's exactly what it seemed like. It was exactly what it was. The air was filled with a sharp discomfort, a mixture of shame, disbelief and anticipation. Everyone was thirsty for his fall. And she had already started. My wife tried to get closer, her eyes pleading, her hands shaking as she tried to touch my arm. Please, let me explain. But there was no explanation that could erase that scene from my mind. No excuse that could make the months, the years, the nights with her seem less false. I moved away, as if her simple contact would contaminate me with the dirt of that betrayal. Explain what? That you left me for this trash. That every kiss, every hug, every "I love you" was a lie. My voice was filled with something I didn't even know I could feel. It wasn't just hate. It was something deeper. It was the death of everything I knew. The entire company watched in absolute silence. The looks that previously held respect for the boss were now filled with disgust. The expressions that saw my wife as a sweet and dedicated woman were now tinged with disbelief. But none of that mattered anymore. What mattered was that I was done with them. Their reputation was ruined. The leader, so unbeatable, so powerful, now seemed smaller, curled up under the weight of his own shame. And my wife, well, she would learn the hard way that there are no ways back from some choices. The shock of that scene spread through the corridors like fire in dry straw. Messages began to pop up on cell phones, gossip spread like a deadly virus. There was no going back for them. There was no way to escape. In a matter of minutes, the scandal would reach proportions that neither of them could contain. And the worst was yet to come. Because betrayal doesn't just destroy hearts, it destroys lives. And I was just beginning to see their castle crumble. But the question that remained in the air, burning like a live coal, was, how far could this fall go? Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not and will never support treason. The stories you will hear are fictional, but they reflect an undeniable truth: betrayal destroys lives, corrodes relationships and always exacts a high price. Each narrative serves as a brutal reminder that the consequences are inevitable. Get ready, because what comes next it's intense, realistic and completely shocking. Now, sit back and feel the impact of this story firsthand. The first rays of the sun filtered through the gaps in the curtains of the spacious apartment on the 10th floor, spilling golden light onto the perfectly arranged furniture. The city outside was already pulsing with its frenetic routine, but inside, time seemed suspended in a moment of familiar tranquility. Ethan slowly woke up, feeling the softness of the sheets against his skin and the warmth of his wife's body beside him. He looked at Olivia for a moment, her hair spread over the pillow, her breathing calm and deep. There was something comforting about that scene, something that made his chest feel warm with the familiarity of their shared years. He lightly touched her hand, an automatic gesture of affection that, over the years, had become almost imperceptible, but still present. A sigh escaped her lips before her eyes slowly opened. She smiled, that small, still sleepy smile that always reminded him of why he had fallen in love. The two had been together for almost a decade. They met at university, when he was still an ambitious young man with dreams of building a solid career, and she was a brilliant student who was overflowing with lightness and charisma. Time had shaped the relationship, transforming that intense passion of youth into something more solid, more stable. But along with stability came routines, commitments, responsibilities that, little by little, consumed the spontaneity of the first years. Ethan spent most of his time at work, always focused on ensuring a comfortable future for the two of them. Olivia, in turn, had built her career in the administrative area and, even though she was busy, she always tried to balance her professional life with moments for two. But lately, he felt like something was different. It wasn't anything obvious, nothing I could point to directly. Just an uncomfortable feeling, as if there was something slightly out of place, an invisible detail hanging in the air. The apartment they lived in was spacious, decorated with a mix of modernity and comfort. They had chosen every detail together, from the pictures hanging on the wall to the arrangement of the furniture. Each corner told a piece of their story, the trips they took, the nights they stayed up talking about the future, the dreams they built together. That space was a reflection of what they had built. But lately, Ethan felt like the house, once so full of life, seemed empty somehow. Olivia was still an attentive wife, they still shared laughs, they still slept side by side, but there was something in her eyes that he couldn't decipher. He got up, walking to the kitchen to prepare breakfast. I liked that morning routine. The smell of coffee filling the air, the sound of the newspaper being folded, the few minutes of tranquility before the day truly began. Olivia entered the kitchen soon after, her hair still disheveled, tying her robe around her body as she leaned against the counter, watching him. He smiled slightly, handing her a cup, and she accepted it, holding it for a moment longer than necessary. "You've been working too hard," she said, her voice soft but filled with something he couldn't define. He laughed quietly, taking a sip of his coffee before answering. "Someone has to keep this house running," he joked, but noticed that she didn't smile the same way she used to. That morning ran its course like any other. He left for work, adjusting his tie in the elevator while checking emails on his cell phone. On the way, he thought about his boss, a charismatic and persuasive man, one of those who always had the right words for any situation. He was respected, admired, and knew exactly how to gain people's trust. Ethan saw him as someone he needed to impress, someone who could open doors to greater opportunities. Working at that company was always a goal, and now that I was there, I knew I needed to stay relevant. But something about the boss's behavior bothered him. There was an excess of confidence, a way of acting that, at times, seemed to exceed limits that he could not define. During the day, Olivia's messages were short, to the point. Nothing out of the ordinary, just trivial conversations about dinner, about bills to pay, about some weekend commitment. But he felt that her words carried a subtle distance, as if there was a space between them that was increasing, inch by inch, without him knowing why. Still, he tried to ignore it, telling himself that it was just in his head, that maybe it was just the accumulated tiredness, the exhausting routine, the inevitable erosion of time. That night he arrived home later than usual. Olivia was sitting on the couch, a glass of wine in her hands, the television turned on at a low volume. She seemed lost in thought, her eyes fixed on the screen without really paying attention. He sat next to her, smelling the soft scent he always liked. For a moment, he wanted to pull her close, to feel the familiarity of her embrace, but something held him back. The invisible barrier seemed bigger that night. "How was your day?" he asked, trying to sound carefree. She turned to him, her eyes assessing him for a moment before responding. "Normal," he said simply, before looking away. They ate dinner together, but the silence between them was different from the comfortable silence they usually shared. Olivia seemed restless, fidgeting with her napkin between her fingers, looking at her phone more often than usual. When he asked what was bothering her, she smiled, shaking her head. "Nothing much, just tired," she said, and he wanted to believe it. "I wanted to believe that it was just tiredness, that feeling was just a reflection of my own exhaustion." But as he lay there that night, staring at the ceiling as he listened to her peaceful breathing beside him, something inside him told him there was more. That something was happening right before his eyes, and he just didn't know what it was. Yet. The days passed in a blur. The routine followed its predictable course, each morning beginning with the sound of the alarm, footsteps shuffling to the kitchen, hot coffee filling the air with a comforting aroma. But the comfort Ethan used to feel in that daily repetition was gone. He felt a strange weight in his chest, an uneasiness that settled in his mind like a seed growing silently. There was something wrong. Something he couldn't name, but it was there, lurking, hidden in Olivia's small gestures, averted glances, and evasive responses. He found himself watching her more than usual, noticing every detail that previously went unnoticed. The way she looked at her phone more often, the way she smiled at the screen before quickly blocking it, as if she were hiding something. The way she seemed more distracted, more distant, as if her mind was always somewhere else. At work, Ethan tried to focus, but his mind kept wandering back home. Meetings felt long and empty, the numbers and graphs that once demanded your attention now seemed irrelevant. His boss, always charismatic and confident, seemed to be in a great mood lately, as if something was going really well in his life. He noticed that the man smiled often, that his gaze carried an unusual satisfaction, a glow that he couldn't decipher. Sometimes I would catch conversations between colleagues that mentioned something about the boss's personal life, but I could never capture the full context. It was on a random night, returning home earlier than usual, that he felt the first real snap inside him. The apartment was silent when he entered. The air felt different, as if something had been abruptly stopped. He dropped his briefcase on the counter and looked around. Olivia wasn't in the living room or in the kitchen. He walked down the hallway towards the bedroom and, before arriving, he heard a muffled sound, something almost imperceptible, but it made his entire body stiffen. A contained laugh, a whisper. The kind of sound that shouldn't be there. His heart raced, his hands grew cold. An irrational fear took over him, but also a desperate urgency to know what was happening. He opened the bedroom door and found only her cell phone on the bed, the screen still on. The name of an unknown contact appeared on the screen, and for a second he stood there, still, feeling the world spin around him. She came out of the bathroom, a look of surprise in her eyes when she saw him holding the device. "Who is it?" he asked, his voice colder than he intended. Olivia hesitated for a moment before taking her cell phone back, her fingers tightening around the device as if it held a secret about to escape. "She's just a friend from work," he said, looking away, but the lie was evident the moment it was uttered. Ethan felt something inside him shatter. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to ignore that growing discomfort, get on with his life without needing to question the woman who had been by his side for so many years. But doubt had already set in, and once it takes root, there is no way to uproot it without pain. That night he barely slept. He lay there, looking at the ceiling, feeling Olivia's calm breathing beside him, wondering if everything they had was real or just an illusion that he forced himself to believe. In the following days, his attention became even sharper. He noticed the subtle changes, the moments when Olivia seemed restless, the excuses to leave early, to arrive later. She began to notice patterns, the frequency with which her boss's name came up in casual conversation, the way she smiled differently when talking about work. The pieces began to fall into place, forming a picture he refused to accept. Until, finally, the day came when the truth imposed itself with brutal clarity. It was a random afternoon, and he decided to go to the company to pick up Olivia. I wanted to surprise her, take her to dinner, remember simpler times. But when he got there, something made him hesitate. He stopped in the parking lot, looked at the building and felt a tightness in his chest. A primitive instinct alerted him to what was about to happen, as if his body already knew the truth before his eyes even saw it. He went up in the elevator, feeling cold sweat run down the back of his neck. The office was quiet, most of the employees had already left. But the door to the chief's office was ajar. He didn't have to push her all the way to see. What he saw in that moment was enough to destroy whatever was left of his confidence. Olivia's body leaning over the table, her boss's lips on hers, his hands exploring every inch of the body that, until that moment, Ethan believed was only his. A lump formed in his throat, but the anger was stronger than the pain. Blind hatred rose through his chest, his hands shaking as they balled into fists. The ground seemed to disappear beneath his feet, everything spinning in slow motion, every detail etched in his mind like an irreversible scar. Time seemed suspended for an instant. Then, he opened the door at once, without hesitation, without mercy. Betrayal was no longer a premonition or a distant fear. Now, it was real, and nothing could erase what he had just seen. The silence that followed his presence in the room was suffocating. Olivia froze, the boss pulling away abruptly, tugging at his tie as if that could undo what had just been exposed. Ethan felt his stomach drop, as if he had been punched in the chest. The heavy breathing made his entire body shake, but it wasn't just anger. It was disgusting, every detail of that scene, every touch, every lie that preceded that moment. Olivia brought a hand to her mouth, her eyes wide, searching for something to say, something that could quell the impending storm. But he didn't want to hear anything. I didn't want excuses, I didn't want empty justifications. I just wish this was a nightmare I could wake up from. The boss recovered too quickly for someone who had just been caught. He adjusted his jacket, looked directly at Ethan and tried to maintain a calm tone, as if he had some control over the situation. "This isn't what it seems," he began, but Ethan's short, bitter laugh cut the air. "Isn't it what it seems? Do you have the courage to say that cliché phrase while you still have the taste of my wife in your mouth?" The weight of his words landed like a punch, and Olivia shuddered. She tried to get closer, her eyes pleading, but he took a step back, as if her mere presence was repulsive. "I can explain," she murmured, and he closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath before looking at her. "Explain what? That you lied to me? That every time you said you loved me was a joke? That all this time I was sleeping next to someone who was no longer my wife?" The pain in his voice was clear, but he wouldn't let her see him weak. "I didn't deserve your tears, your compassion." The boss took a step forward, trying to take control of the situation. "I know this is hard to process, but maybe it's best if we talk like adults without making a scene." It was the last straw. Ethan stepped forward, anger pulsing through his veins, his fists clenched, ready to punch the man who destroyed his marriage. But before he could do anything, Olivia stepped between the two. "Please stop. Don't do that." Her voice was a mix of despair and guilt, but he didn't want to hear it. "Now you want to avoid a scene. Now you want me to be rational. Where was that rationality when you decided to throw everything away?" The boss opened his mouth to speak, but was interrupted when the door to the room opened and a group of employees appeared in the hallway. The buzz had already spread. The scandal was underway. The fixed looks, some shocked, others eager for more details. The boss's reputation, the same one he had always preserved as his most valuable asset, began to crumble right there, in front of everyone. But what Ethan didn't expect was that the destruction wouldn't stop there. One of the company's directors rushed in, pulling his boss by the arm. "We need to talk. Now." The man hesitated, still trying to maintain his posture, but when he saw his superior's serious look, he knew there was no escape. Olivia was motionless, as if she had lost her footing. But it wasn't just because of the exposed betrayal. It was something deeper, something she seemed to know hadn't surfaced yet. And then, it came. The conversation that unfolded in the director's office was confirmation that this was just the beginning of the fall. The boss had not only destroyed a marriage, but also his own career. The company had a strict clause against internal relationships that involved an imbalance of power, and Ethan knew right then, in those tense minutes, that Olivia wasn't the only one. Other women began to appear, testimonies emerging like a domino effect, revealing that he used his position to approach, to involve, to manipulate. The image of an impeccable man was crumbling before everyone's eyes, and Ethan realized that, as much as his life was falling apart at that moment, at least he wasn't the one who was losing everything. Olivia was sitting in the corner of the room, her head down, her hands shaking. She knew. "I knew I wasn't special. I knew I wasn't the only one." Her gaze met Ethan's for a moment, and he saw something there that almost made him feel sorry. But he didn't feel it. Because in that moment, she was no longer the woman he loved. He was just someone who had lost himself, who had exchanged everything for something empty, something that never had real value. He got up, grabbed his coat and walked to the door. Before leaving, he turned to her one last time. "I hope it was worth it." And then, he left behind not only the room, but also the weight of everything he carried there. What Olivia would do from that moment on was no longer his problem. The boss was desperately trying to contain the damage, but it was too late. And Ethan knew that soon, he would have a lot more to lose than just a job. And then, at that moment, when everything seemed to be resolved, the last bomb exploded. Olivia, still in shock, received a notification on her cell phone. When he opened it, the blood drained from his face. It was an anonymous email, a complete dossier, evidence organized in detail, attached documents, screenshots. Everything the boss had done in recent years, all the hidden relationships, all the women who had been manipulated, everything that until then had been buried in the shadows. The sender's name? A former employee who had been fired without explanation months ago. Ethan didn't see her burst into tears. He didn't see when his boss realized that not only was his career over, but that, with those tests, his freedom was also threatened. But none of that mattered. Because he was no longer part of that story. He had already left, heading towards a future where that betrayal would no longer have power over him. The night air felt heavier when Ethan finally left the company building. The cold wind hit his face, but it wasn't enough to dispel the suffocating feeling that still pressed his chest. He walked to his car, opened the door with shaking hands and got behind the wheel, without starting it. The events of the last few hours swirled in his mind like a chaotic whirlwind. Every detail, every expression, every word spoken and unspoken weighed on him like invisible chains. Olivia. Your boss. The scandal. The inevitable destruction that would follow. Should he feel satisfaction? Should I feel some kind of relief seeing them sinking into their own chaos? But all he felt was a void inside him, an absence of anything that could remind him of who he was before all this happened. He ran his hands over his face, took a deep breath and looked straight ahead. I couldn't stay there. I didn't want to go home, a place that now felt like a tomb of everything that had once been important. So, without thinking much, he turned the key in the ignition and drove away without a specific destination. The city lights blurred around him, but he didn't really see anything. He just drove, letting the movement of the car follow the speed of the thoughts he couldn't control. It was only when the phone vibrated next to him that his attention snapped back to reality. Olivia's name flashed on the screen. He ignored it. But the cell phone continued to vibrate, insistent, as if each call was a desperate scream on the other end of the line. Until finally, he answered. "What do you want?" His voice was firm, sharp, loaded with something he didn't even bother to hide. On the other side, she hesitated. Her breathing was shaky, the weight of the silence stretched out for endless seconds before she managed to speak. "Please listen to me, just listen to me." He didn't say anything. There was nothing she could say that would erase what happened. But still, he allowed her to continue. "I ruined everything." Her voice was broken, filled with an anguish that he knew was real, but that no longer affected him in the same way. "I know you hate me now, that nothing I say can change what happened, but I need you to know. I never wanted it to be like this." He let out a dry, bitter laugh. "You never wanted to. So what exactly did you want? What did you think was going to happen when you decided to deceive me?" She took a deep breath on the other side, as if trying to find the strength to continue. "I was stupid. I was weak. And now I've lost everything. But there's one thing you don't know. Something that makes everything even worse." And then came the break. That second of hesitation that made something inside him alert. He remained silent, waiting, feeling each beat of his own heart increase the tension in the air. "He didn't really want me," she finally said, her voice breaking. "I thought that I was special, that somehow I meant something to him. But it was all a lie. Just as he did to me, he did to so many others. I was just one more." Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. This was nothing new to him. I already knew that the boss had a history of manipulation, that he used his position to win over women and throw them away when they lost the novelty. But hearing this from her, realizing that she only understood the extent of his betrayal when she found herself discarded, brought a new wave of bitterness. "And what do you want from me? Sympathy? Do you want me to say I'm sorry for what happened to you? Do you want me to forget all this and go home as if nothing happened?" "No," she hurried to reply. "I know there is no going back. I know I destroyed you. But I also know he will pay. Ethan, there's something you don't know." And then, the missing truth came. The final blow, the piece of the puzzle that, when revealed, would make everything even more devastating. "He promised me things. He promised I would have nothing to lose. That even if we were discovered, he had everything under control. But he lied. And now, everything he did, all the women, everything is going to explode." Ethan was silent, absorbing every word. "What are you trying to tell me?" She hesitated before answering. Someone who was harmed by him finally got proof. Documents, emails, testimonies. He's not just going to lose his job. He could be arrested. He took a deep breath, feeling something different come over him. It wasn't just satisfaction. It was justice. Justice for what happened to him. Justice for the women who have gone through this before. Justice for the arrogance of that man who thought he could manipulate anyone and get away with it. "And how do you know that?" His voice was lower now, more calculated. "Because I received everything in my email. Evidence that could end him. And if I get this to the right people, he'll never get up again." And that's when Ethan realized. Olivia knew she was ruined. "I knew I would never have his trust again. I knew I had become just another in that man's long list of mistakes. But this was his last chance to do something right. Her last attempt to repair, even if minimally, what she had caused." He sighed, running a hand through his hair, feeling a different weight this time. "Then do it," he said finally. "Hand over everything. Finish him." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line before she responded. "I go." And then, the call ended. Ethan stood there, standing in the car, staring into space, feeling that somehow, even with all the pain, with all the chaos, this story was about to come to an end. But an end that, this time, would not be defined by betrayal, but for justice. That night seemed different from any other. Ethan drove slowly, feeling the city pass around him like a distant scene. The phone remained silent next to him, no new calls, no new messages. Olivia had made her decision and was now taking action. He knew that everything that would happen from then on was inevitable, like a storm that could no longer be contained. But even with the boss's imminent fall, even though he knew that justice would finally be done, the feeling that weighed on him was not one of victory. It wasn't relief. It was something denser, something that made him question whether there really was a way to get out of that story without leaving deep scars. He parked the car in front of the building where he lived and stayed there for a few minutes, looking at the facade without really seeing it. That place no longer felt like home. It was just a space filled with memories that were now contaminated. Entering that apartment meant confronting the void that Olivia had left, the echo of betrayal still permeating every wall, every piece of furniture, every familiar smell that once represented safety. But there was nowhere else to go. He took a deep breath and climbed up, feeling each step weighing more than the last. When he opened the door, silence greeted him almost aggressively. He turned on the light in the room, his eyes scanning the room as if hoping to find some change, something that would justify the restlessness within him. But everything was in the same place. The photos on the sideboard still showed happy moments frozen in time, the blanket on the sofa still carried the perfume that once brought him comfort. But nothing made sense anymore. He walked to the kitchen, opened the refrigerator just out of habit, grabbed a bottle of water and drank it leisurely. The bland taste seemed to reflect exactly how he felt. No flavor, no life. He sat in the living room armchair, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped in front of his face. Treason had already been exposed. The truth about the boss was already in motion, and it wouldn't be long before the world around them completely collapsed. But what then? What's left? A ruined marriage, an entire life built on the illusion of a love that no longer existed. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to find an answer within himself, but all he found was a deep emptiness. It was then that the phone vibrated. A new unknown number appeared on the screen, and he hesitated before answering it. Hello? His voice came out rougher than he intended, but he didn't care. On the other side, a voice he recognized immediately. The boss. Ethan, we need to talk. There was a pause, as if the man was gathering the strength to continue. You think you won? You think you can destroy my life that easily? Ethan didn't respond right away. He just took a deep breath, letting the silence weigh in the air. I wasn't the one who destroyed your life. You did it alone. The boss let out a low laugh, but there was no humor there. Just something dark, something about to fall apart. You don't know who you're dealing with. It's not going to end like this. The threat didn't surprise him. On the contrary, it confirmed everything I already expected. Yes, it ends. You have nowhere left to run. Everything you've done is about to come to light. And you know it. There was another silence on the other side, longer this time. When the boss spoke again, his voice no longer had the same arrogance as before. You don't understand. If I fall, I won't fall alone. I'll take everyone with me. Ethan gripped the phone tighter. Then do it. Expose everything. But don't think you can get to me. I've already lost everything that matters. The boss let out an audible sigh, and for a moment he seemed about to say something more. But then, the line went dead. He hung up without further threats, without further justification. Just a silence that said more than any words could. Ethan stood there, holding his cell phone in his hand, feeling a different weight this time. It wasn't fear. It wasn't uncertainty. It was the certainty that, regardless of what happened next, he had already passed the point of no return. The hours passed and, with them, the outcome began to take shape. The news exploded in different media. Leaked reports, testimonies that began to emerge, women who were once afraid now finding the courage to speak out. The boss's name was splashed across headlines, and every sordid detail of his conduct was exposed to the public. The company had already made its decision. Not only would he lose his position, but he would also face serious charges and could be brought to justice. And Olivia? There was nowhere left to run. Her reputation was also tarnished. Betrayal was no longer just a secret behind four walls, but a public story, something everyone knew. Ethan watched everything from a distance. He didn't get involved, he didn't seek active revenge. He just let the truth do its work. He knew that from that moment on, everything would change. But that didn't mean everything was resolved. It was then that, in the midst of the chaos, something unexpected happened. A fortuitous meeting, a look that met his in a moment of complete disconnection. A woman, different from Olivia in every way, but who carried a story of her own in her eyes, marked by pains he didn't yet know. She didn't know anything about him, she didn't see him as the betrayed man, as the victim of a scandal. I just saw him as someone trying to move on. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt something new. Something he still couldn't name, but which brought a ray of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this story still had a chapter worth writing. Ethan felt the storm beginning to dissipate, but it didn't leave behind a clear sky. The trail of destruction that the betrayal and recent events had caused still weighed on him, as if each memory was an open scar, a wound that took time to close. However, there was something different that morning. The news about the boss was already everywhere. He was no longer a powerful man, no longer a respected figure. It was just a scandal, an irreversible stain that would mark him forever. Olivia, on the other hand, was missing from the radar. She no longer tried to get in touch, she didn't try to justify herself, as if she had accepted the weight of the consequences that had fallen on her. As he drove through the city, Ethan found himself thinking about what came next. There was a strange freedom in the fact that he no longer had anything to lose. The marriage was over, his old boss was destroyed, and all the certainties he once had about his life had crumbled. But what came next? What do you do when everything you knew no longer exists? It was in the midst of this whirlwind of thoughts that he noticed someone he didn't expect to see. Sitting alone in a cafe, staring into space with a blank expression, was Olivia. Ethan parked the car but didn't get out immediately. He stayed there for a moment, watching her. She looked smaller than she remembered. The weight of shame and humiliation was visible in every gesture, in the way he held the cup of coffee without even bringing it to his mouth, in the eyes that used to shine with vivacity and were now opaque. He could have just walked away. I could ignore it and move on. But something inside him wanted to see. I wanted to hear. When he entered the cafe and walked up to her, Olivia looked up and froze for a moment. Her expression wavered between surprise and resignation, as if she knew that moment would come sooner or later. Ethan, his voice was low, almost like a sigh. He pulled out a chair and sat down opposite her, without rushing, without anger. Just with the need to end it once and for all. "Why are you still here?" he asked, and there was no aggression in his voice. Just genuine curiosity. Olivia looked away, playing with the rim of her cup. "Because I have nowhere to go." There was a moment of silence before she continued. "I lost everything. The work, the reputation, you. There's nothing left." Ethan didn't feel sorry. But he felt a kind of understanding he hadn't expected. He knew what it was like to lose everything. He knew what it was like to see his life crumble before his eyes. But the difference between the two was that he was not responsible for his own downfall. "You knew this would happen," he said calmly, and she nodded, her eyes glistening with tears that she seemed determined not to shed. "I knew," she admitted, "but I never thought I would lose you completely." Ethan let out a sigh, resting his arms on the table. Olivia, you haven't lost me now. You lost me the moment you decided to betray me. The words came out with a weight he didn't even know he still carried, and he saw their impact on her face. She passed her hand over her face, as if to erase the guilt written there. If I could go back, but he interrupted her before she finished. But you can't. The silence that came after that was absolute. The two just stood there, facing the truth that hung between them like an insurmountable barrier. Finally, Olivia let out a shaky breath and looked away. I just wanted you to know that I really loved you. Even with everything I've done. Ethan didn't respond right away. He just watched her, feeling that those words didn't change anything. Maybe they were true, maybe they were just something she wanted to believe. But love alone is never enough. Not when it is accompanied by lies and betrayal. He got up, took out his wallet and left enough money to cover her coffee. I hope you find a way to fix your life, he said simply. And then, without looking back, he left the cafe, leaving her behind for the last time. That conversation, strangely, didn't make him any heavier. On the contrary. As he stepped out onto the street, he felt as if something had been resolved within him. As if I had finally ended a cycle that should have ended a long time ago. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he could breathe without the feeling that the air was tainted by the past. And then, his cell phone vibrated in his pocket. An unexpected message, from a number he recognized immediately. It wasn't Olivia. There was no one connected to the past. It was something new. Something different. And in that moment, Ethan knew his life wasn't over. On the contrary. Perhaps, for the first time in a long time, she was just getting started. Time passed, as it always passes, indifferent to the chaos it leaves behind. The headlines were replaced by new scandals, new names appearing on the covers of newspapers and news websites. The world moved on. But for those who lived through this story, the scars were still visible, the wreckage was still being swept up. Ethan watched everything from afar, without rushing, without the need to interfere. He had already done his part. Now, all that was left was to watch the events unfold. The former boss, once a figure of power and influence, was now nothing more than an embarrassed, exposed man with no way out. The evidence against him was irrefutable, and the company not only fired him, but sued him for inappropriate conduct and abuse of power. The media devoured every detail of the case, making any attempt to reconstruct the image impossible. His name was dirty, his reputation irrecoverable. But the worst was yet to come. The authorities joined the case, and the formal accusation soon followed. The arrest didn't take long. The scene of his capture was broadcast on several channels, the man who once saw himself as untouchable now being escorted by police, handcuffed, his expression blank, defeated. He had nowhere else to run. And Ethan knew, in that moment, that he would never be anyone again. As for Olivia, her destruction was slower. She lost everything gradually, feeling each loss as a new blow, a constant reminder of her undoing. She was fired shortly after the scandal was exposed, her name circulating in the company corridors like a whisper of derision. No other company wanted to hire her after that. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was professional. Her involvement with a man who manipulated subordinates made her undesirable in the job market. The doors closed one by one, until no one was left open. He tried to rebuild himself in some way, he tried to erase his own history, but the internet doesn't forget. The looks of people on the streets, the comments, the silent judgments weighed more than she could bear. The last time Ethan found out about her was through a mutual acquaintance. Olivia had left the city, without a clear destination. Her marriage was legally over, and all that was left of her was a bitter memory. He didn't feel hate. Nor compassion. Just indifference. She was in the past. A past that no longer deserved space in his life. And him? Ethan moved on. It wasn't quick, nor easy. Overcoming does not mean forgetting, but learning to live despite what happened. Found a new routine, new goals. He began to see possibilities that he had not even considered before. And eventually, he crossed paths with someone who wasn't part of that destroyed past. An unexpected meeting, a look exchanged at any moment, but which carried something different. No rush, no unrealistic expectations. Just something new, something that could genuinely grow. Life never goes back to what it was before a betrayal. But if there's one thing Ethan has learned, it's that it can be rebuilt. And sometimes, what comes after is much better than what was once lost. Now, I want to know your opinion. What did you think of the end of this story? Do you believe that everyone got the fate they deserved? Leave your comment, I really want to know what you think about this. And of course, if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, take the opportunity to subscribe now and turn on notifications so you don't miss any stories like this. Here, we do not support cheating. Betrayal destroys lives, and this story was just another example of how the consequences always arrive. See you in the next story.